This is the Bethany Podcast Network, which is part of the ministry at Bethany Baptist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And now, today's message. I want you to know, I have good news for you. On my way up here, my man Guy, who runs our soundboard, handed me my microphone. He let me know that before the service started, a little bit before, my mic was at about 13 hours. And he wanted me to know I now have 14 hours of juice. And I said, y'all be ready because we're going to use all 14 hours. Let's do it. Okay, but we are back in the book of James. Okay, we have been looking at the book of James. You can go ahead and turn to James chapter 5. Put your finger there, hold it. We're going to get to it in just a few moments. But I think I speak for many people when I say that as we've been studying the book of James, this has been a pretty wild book. And this has been a pretty wild sermon series. Several people have come up to me talking about the series so far and about just reading through James. And pretty much everybody has said the same thing. And they tell me, man, this is a hard book, right? But it's a helpful book. It's a good book. It's been a very profitable book to read. It's been challenging, but it's hard, but not necessarily hard from the perspective of it's hard to understand. Matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. It's quite easy to understand. It's a hard book because it's been emotionally heavy. It's been spiritually heavy. And not only for them, but it's also been that way for me. Matter of fact, reading James, I've told several people, reading James and studying through James with you all, it sort of felt like what I would imagine stepping into a ring with Mike Tyson would feel like, or an MMA fighter, right? I have no idea what that's like, would like to never find out what that's like. Okay, but it has been a lot of heavy lifting. It's been very convicting, right? Because the reality is James doesn't pull any punches, right? But here's the thing, in this life, there is a big question that looms in front of every person and every Christian, right? The question is not, is God on your side? Okay, the question is not, is God on your side? Because I think everybody thinks that God is on their side. Everybody thinks that God is on their side, right? I think that's one reason why we have such a hard time with humility, because we don't really need to be the humble ones if we have the all-holy, all-powerful God behind us, right? We're the righteous ones. But here's the thing. If everybody feels like God is on their side and nobody needs humility because everybody has the righteousness that they need, we're not only going to have tough societies and cultures and church families, right? But we're going to have a hard time worshiping too. The question isn't, is God on our side? Everybody thinks that God is on their side. Matter of fact, America thinks that God is on their side. Israel thinks that God is on their side. Russia thinks that God is on their side. Politicians think that God endorses their agenda or their platform. Almost every single one of them. Okay? Bosses may think that God is on their side while employees are hoping and praying that he's on theirs. Okay? Christians think that God is on their side, but people of other faiths think that God is on their side. Everyone wants to believe that God is on their side. But what James is trying to show us is that God is not necessarily on any of our sides. Now understand, yes, the Bible is very, very clear that for those that belong to Jesus, for those that are believers, God is for us, okay? And he's also with us. Scripture is very clear about both of those points. But I argue that God's not on our side. We even see this in the book of Joshua. We're not going to stay here. I'm just going to read really quick. But in the book of Joshua, God is about to conquer Jericho through Joshua and the Israelites, and Joshua sees this mysterious messenger approach, and says this, verses 13 to 14, it says that when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him with a sword drawn in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the man replied, "Neither. I have come as a commander of the Lord's armies," right? Now, if you do kind of an unpacking of this story, this narrative in Joshua, you come to find out there's some discussion as to who this commander of the Lord's army is. Is this commander an angelic messenger? Possibly. Is this commander God himself, what's called a theophany, right? Where God would appear in human form, right? Regardless, here's what nobody's confused about. They know that this is a direct message from God and that God is speaking directly to Joshua and Israel. And Joshua asks him, are you for us or are you for our enemies? And God's answer is neither. I am not for you and I'm not for your enemies, because God doesn't join our sides for our purposes. He has his own side. The question that James is placing before us is not, is God on your side, but are you on his side? That's really the question that's at hand, is are you on God's side? And in 5 chapters, James, what he's been showing us is what a relationship with God looks like practically. And as he does, I think one of the reasons why many of us are coming up feeling kind of battered and bruised is because we all want to think that we are on God's side. But as we're reading through James, we're starting to realize that our words and our lives tend to show otherwise. That we're not always the people of faith and obedience that we want to think that we are. That we're not always the hearers and doers of the word that we think we are. And I think that's why it feels sort of like we've been taken out to the spiritual woodshed, so to speak, as we've been reading James, and why we feel so kind of worn out as we've been going through it. And so now that we've been through 4 chapters of James, we're now moving into the last chapter of James. James has been pretty blunt in his words, right? Matter of fact, if you forgot already, just last week he called Christians, all the wayward Christians who are not hearers and doers of the words, those that say they love God, but they're living otherwise. He has already called all of us adulterers, right? Spiritual adulterers. Surely as we're running into chapter 5, here's where he's going to relent a little bit. He's going to pull back a little bit. Here's where the encouraging word has to come, right? Well, let's look. James chapter 5, let's read verses 1 through 6 to start with. Says this, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. Your wealth and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and the corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have stored up treasure in the last day." So, yeah, it doesn't look like he's letting up much. Okay. Verse 4, "Look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who mowed your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of armies. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned. You have murdered the righteous who does not resist you." This is the word of the Lord. Okay, so James isn't letting up. This is some pretty strong language, some pretty strong wording. But here's the thing you need to remember. The book of James is a letter to Christians. It's a letter. The chapters and the verses that we reference, okay, when I say turn to James chapter 5, right, that's a common point. It was something, the verses and the chapters, the verse numbers and the chapters were added to the Bible much later as a point of reference so that it was much easier when we're teaching and I can say, hey, let's look at James 5 together. And everybody here universally, for the most part, either knows where that is or you can find it with the table of contents, right? What that means is if this is a letter, right, and the verses and the chapters were added later, that means when James wrote this, he didn't write, you know what, we need to keep going, chapter 5. Verse 1, right? What he's doing is he's just writing one continuous thought, which means chapter 5 is not the continuation, it's not the beginning of a new thought, but chapter 5 is actually the continuation of a previous thought, right? And so even though James starts out pretty strong in what we call chapter 5, what he's doing is he's actually finishing up his words from chapter 4. And so when he's starting chapter 5, what he's doing is he's giving one more example of disobedient faith. And this time he's confronting Christians who have power, Christians who have wealth, specifically those that are abusing their wealth and abusing their power, the ones that are not willing to pay their people. They're like, I'm going to pay them as little as I can so that I can make as much as I can, right? And because of their positions of power or their accomplishments or the titles or the initials after their name or before their name, right? Because of their wealth or their prominence, these people have either developed a false sense of security and confidence that's built on their prominence in their position, or they've grown arrogant because of their power or their wealth. But either way, what James is telling us is that this is The same type of Christian that he's been talking about this whole time. It's just a different flavor, but the exact same model, right? What we're still dealing with are prideful Christians. These are Christians who have grown prideful, right? Just like he's already been addressing and tackling in previous chapters. And instead of caring for people, these prideful Christians have built wealth at the expense of other people. So they've brought harm to other people. So James is warning them, and in warning them, what he's saying yet another way, because we read this verse last week, which is, by the way, a reference from Old Testament as well. He reminds them, listen, you wealthy, prominent business owners, landowners, people with titles, people with degrees, you the people with the money, you the people with the positions, don't forget that God resists the proud, right? Resist is a military term, means he fights back, he stands up against, he stands in the gap of, we talked about that a lot last week, that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So following these verses, right? So that's verses 1-6. But following these verses, the tone of James does change. Starting with verse 7 to the end of the book of James, we now change from a confronting type of tone to a more encouraging tone, reminding believers that their true faith, right, that they're called to walk in and remain obedient to God and his word still stands, that they are still called to love God with all of their heart, all their mind, all their soul, all their strength, even when it gets hard. Right? So let's keep reading. We're going to read James 5. We're going to keep reading verse 7-12, and that's where we're going to stop for the day. For the reading part, at least. Verse 7, it says, so therefore, brothers and sisters, right? As a reminder, the word therefore is there for a reason, right? Everything that comes before is now feeding everything that's about to come after. Okay, so because of all the hard stuff and all the hard teachings and all the hard statements and all the confronting words that James has used, because of all of those things, he says, therefore, brothers and sisters, as you're going through this, be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer, he waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your heart, because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another, so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. Brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. See, we count as blessed those who have endured. You have heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes mean yes and let your no mean no, so that you won't fall under judgment. This is also the word of the Lord. So here's a very simple, but a very undeniable reality. Because here's the thing. We all want to know that we can trust people, right? And almost to a person, everybody goes, man, this world is not very trustworthy. What happened to the days when people could keep their word, right? We hear this all the time. Here's a very simple, but undeniable reality. And it's this, is that when someone consistently keeps their word, you may not always remember the promise, but you'll always remember their reliability. Okay? When someone consistently keeps their word, you may not always remember the promises that they're keeping, but the one thing you're never going to forget is that they have proven themselves time and time again to be reliable. They keep their word. At our core, I think that most people want to be reliable people. But the reality is we live in a world of maybes, and half yeses, half promises, and unfulfilled promises, where people say yes to something, but then they don't follow through. We live in a world where people say yes to everything and constantly overcommit themselves to things, but then they can't keep up with anything they put their yes to. We live in a world where people are going to say yes, but then make every kind of excuse as to why they can't keep or make their commitment. We live in a world where instead of just saying no, people constantly will say, or yes, they'll say, well, let me see. I'll get back to you later. So they dodge a straight up yes or a dodge a straight up no. People end up having to chase to get an answer. But usually when we say, well, let me see, that's usually code for, let me see about it. If something else that's more exciting or more important doesn't come up, then I'll still think about it. Right? But what James is calling Christians and telling Christians is that we are called to be people of our word. He tells us to let our yes be yes and our no be no, especially when it comes to our faith. And what he says is we don't need to swear in God's name. And this isn't talking about cursing, right? Shouldn't do that either. But he's not talking about cursing at this point. When he's saying you don't need to swear in God's name, what that means is you don't have to throw out lofty promises like, well, I promise to God that this, right? Or that you don't have to make oaths. We don't need to make lofty promises like, God, if you get me through this, then I promise I'll do that. What he's saying is, just let your yes be yes. Your words should be so strong to people that when you say yes, people know they can count on it. And if you say no, they trust there's a good reason for it. From a faith perspective, if we commit to follow God, then what James is telling us is then we need to live like it. If we put our yes on the table and we said, yes, God, I am in, then our lives ought to have a receipt. Our lives become the receipt of that yes. Our former pastor, Pastor Phil, he retired several years ago, but he used to kind of make this joke all the time where he would say that he's baptized so many people who were, as soon as he baptized them, they were like, man, I love Jesus. I love this church. I can't wait to grow in this church. I can't wait to grow in my faith. I'm all for Jesus. So he baptizes them. And then a week later, even the FBI can't find them. Right? I've had people come up to me at weddings or at funerals, speaking engagements that I've spoken at. I've had people call the church asking for counseling. They'll come and sit with me, people from outside the church. And when we get done, they'll look at me and they'll say, Pastor, you're going to see me this Sunday. You mark my words. You're going to see me Sunday. I am ready to follow Jesus. I am ready to join the church. I'm ready to charge hell with a water pistol. I am ready. I am ready. I am ready. And guess what? Never see them. What verse 12 is telling us is that God is calling us to be people of our yeses. To let our yes be yes, which means if we're going to commit to him, then we need to walk in that commitment. And if we're not, then at least just be honest and say no, but stop saying maybe later, not right now, not a good season, not a good time. The answer before us when deciding if we're going to follow the Lord is either yes, Lord, I'm in, or no, Lord, I'm not. But there's not a middle ground there's not like a layaway program for faith, right? Where I can get it now and then pay later. How many of you seen The Karate Kid? The original one, not any of the knockoffs, right? The original. In it, Mr. Miyagi, he's talking to Daniel-san about his decisions, and he tells him, right? He says, he's talking about being on a road, decisions like a road. He says, if you walk on the right side of the road, you're what? You're safe. If you walk on the left side of the road, you're safe. But if you walk in the middle, just like grape, right? Well, here's the thing. It's sort of the same thing. If we walk on the right side of the road and we say yes, we're safe. If we say no, right, God, I want to follow you, and we say no, we walk on the left side of the road, we're not necessarily eternally safe, but here's the thing. You're honest and you're consistent. At least now the answer is on the table and we know where you're at. But if you want to spend your life playing the middle and going back and forth, waffling back and forth between maybe I am or maybe I'm not, maybe I will be this week and maybe I won't be next week, just like grape, right? When our yes turns into a maybe, the only person we're fooling is ourselves. But here's the reality. Your life echoes all around you. Your yes being a maybe may fool you, but the Lord knows the intentions and the motivations of your heart. And by the way, so do the people around you, because your life screams your real answer. The way that you live your life tells a lot about what your heart is actually full of, which is what Luke tells us, right? Luke 6:45, out of the abundance of our heart, our mouth will speak, our lives will live. If we think that we can play the part of a Christian and just hover in the middle, not too committed, because we don't want people to think we're crazy, right? We want to play the part of a Christian. We want to look faithful without actually having to give up too much, just like grape. God's desire is for our full yes, our full surrender to him, not our maybe, not our we'll see. He wants our yes. So what does it look like to walk in our yes? If we're going to put our yes on the table and commit to following Jesus, then what does it look like to honor and walk in that commitment? One way that we walk in our yes is that we love other believers. We love and build up other believers. We love and care for Jesus's church. Matter of fact, James, this isn't the first time James mentions this. He mentions this back in chapter 2. He mentions it in chapter 4. We read it last week. We didn't have enough time to hit it. So we kind of like did a little quick touchdown and go. We were like, psh, psh, and took off, right? But it was mentioned in chapter 4. If you want to think about chapter 1 with the widows and orphans and that we should be caring for widows and orphans and you want to lump that into this, then that means this is the 4th time that he mentions it. So 3 or 5 chapters, but 3 or 4 times, James talks about how essential it is if we're hearers and doers of the word, if we're people of faith and obedience, how essential it is that we are to care for and love other believers, that we are to care for Jesus's church. I'm guessing it must be important. And in verse 9, what James tells us, he says, don't complain about, right? In other words, don't judge, don't grow tired of fellow believers, right? Because if that's the case, it gets hard for people out there to believe that God lives here with us if they never see God's love reflected in how we care for one another. Right? That's why even in 1 John chapter 4, John tells believers, listen, if you say you love God, but you hate your brother or your sister, you're a liar and the truth isn't in you. Now, most Christians are going to say, well, I'm not a judgmental person. I don't want to judge other people because it's wrong to do so. And you'd be right for saying that. We don't want to be those type of people. But here's the reality. How many Christians will gossip and then call it a prayer request? Just saying. How many will hold grudges instead of offering forgiveness? How many Christians will withhold compassion instead of offering grace? How many Christians will say they're not judgmental, but they're going to make quick snap judgments instead of seeking understanding? How many Christians are going to go to church, but then refuse to be a healthy member of a church who's helping to build up the church? Walking in our yes means learning how to truly love other believers and not just talking about it. Walking in our yes also means to remember that faith and obedience is a process. We're still cooking. We're not done. Verse 7 and 8 says it like this. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. You must also be patient. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. Now, I've never been a farmer. Full disclosure, may shock you. Never been a farmer. I did grow potatoes in a bucket this year, though, so I'm on my way. 2 buckets, I think I get to call myself a farmer. But here's the thing. I may not be a farmer, but living in North Carolina for the past 2 decades, I've been around some. I've been able to pastor farmers. I've been able to pastor children of farmers. And I've learned a little bit about farming just by sharing life with them. And here's something that I've learned about farming is that it is a hard job. It is a tedious job. And it requires 2 things. It requires persistence in the small, routine, mundane things. It requires persistence. And it also requires patience in the waiting because farming is a process. It's not fast and it's not easy. I heard an analogy a long time ago about farming versus stores, like in relation to like our faith life. And thanks to the advent of mass production, we lost sight of the value of the process that comes from farming. We just like it when food shows up. We DoorDash and we Uber Eats now, right? If you want a watermelon, just go to the store and buy one. You want apple juice? Just go buy a gallon. You want a potato? Well, what kind of potato do you want? Do you want it French fried, mashed, boiled, hashed, skilleted, tatered and totted? Like, what kind of potato do you want? Here's the beautiful part. You don't have to do much for it. You don't have to plant the potatoes. You don't have to grow them. You don't have to water them. You don't have to look after them. You don't have to harvest them. All you have to do is go to a store or go to a restaurant if you don't want to cook them and go to the store, right? And if that's still too slow for you, hit a drive-through. And if you still don't want to do that, just pick up your phone and DoorDash and get you some food there. You can hit a drive-through or have some food delivered to you. There ain't nothing wrong with that, by the way. Convenience is awesome when it comes to food. But let me tell you something. There's no such thing as an easy or a convenient faith. There's no such thing as an easy or a convenient faith. Faith and obedience is a process. And if we think we can just do our own version, that maybe I just make a couple calls and the easy stuff just shows up at my house, we're mistaken. Faith and obedience is a process. Faith and obedience does the hard work that's necessary, but it trusts God for the growth, just like farmers who sit and wait for the rains. Convenience may have its benefits, but somewhere along the way, we've lost sight and forgotten that real growth only comes from trusting God in this process. And you cannot rush this process. We look at the faith of somebody who's 5, 10, 15 years later than us, and we go, that's what I want right now. And we try to rush that process. We're like, I just want to have all of that. I want to teach right now. Yes, I just started coming to church yesterday, but I think I should hold a microphone and stand in front of people and start telling them all that I know about Jesus. We rush the process, and we cannot rush that process. We cannot bypass the process. There is no drive-through faith. Faith and obedience is a process. Our yes is the starting point of it, but our yes is also our reminder to trust that process and to do the hard work necessary in it so that we might endure, so that we might keep going, which means, lastly, walking in our yes also means that we want to learn the value of endurance. Let your yes not only be yes, but let your yes stay yes. Let your yes stay yes. Our yes is not supposed to be a yes for now or yes when it's convenient. It's an enduring yes. Matter of fact, all the way back in James chapter 1, that was the very first thing that James said. In verses 2-4, he said, "Consider it joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith will develop perseverance. It'll develop endurance. Endurance must finish its work so that you might be mature and complete, not lacking anything." If you desire spiritual maturity, it's not going to be found in a life that runs when things get hard. It's going to be found in a life that learns the power of stay. A life that finds power in a life that endures. Matter of fact, in verse 10, what James challenges Christians, he goes, listen, when you are facing insurmountable obstacles and trials in your life, you should think back to the prophets and examples that are in Scripture. Ordinary people who God did some crazy things through their story. Matter of fact, that's one reason why I like to read those people, right? Is because we're like, man, how wild is their story? That this was just an ordinary shepherd boy. This was just an ordinary student. This was just an ordinary guy. That was just an ordinary fisherman. It was just an ordinary. But then at one point or another, God did something radical in their life, right? And the thing that we celebrate in their story is that when we're reading their story, they tend to face 1, 2, 20, 30 major obstacles that at some point they look at their life and they go, should I stay or should I go? And the reason that we love reading their story is because they stayed. It was their endurance. Moses, we love to talk about Moses. But Moses didn't want to go to Egypt. He asked for somebody else. He's like, can we call up the B team? How about the C team? We'll take the D team. Moses wanted to run, but in faith and endurance, he went. Gideon chose to hide instead of to lead initially. Elijah begged God to take his life. Jeremiah wanted to quit ministry and run. James, in this passage, he uses the example of Job, who Job loses everything. He loses his kids. He loses his business. He loses his family, right? He loses everything, and it crushed him. How does it not crush him? And it crushes him so much so that at one point, Job even curses the day that he was born. It's like, man, I wish I was never even born. All he wanted to do was run and give up. But instead of running from God, he ran to God. His yes wasn't just yes when it was convenient. His yes stayed yes, even in the most unthinkable circumstances. Understand something. There are going to be seasons in your faith life that running from God sounds so much easier than staying. You might even be in that season right now. For some of you, may already be a couple miles into running from God. But what James is encouraging Christians as he's writing to them is because you have to remember all the way back in James 1, he's writing to Christians who are facing insurmountable objects, insurmountable issues and situations in their life. That's why he said, consider it joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. What James is encouraging Christians that he's writing to is to remember the power of stay. Yes, you might find relief if you run. But what happens when you face hard times again? Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. What happens when you run? And you face another hard time, what are you going to do? Run again, and then run again, and then run again? Are you going to spend your life running? Understand something. Our greatest moments and power of growth in our lives is never going to come by running from God. It's going to come from the power of learning to stay. It's going to come from learning how to walk in the muck and the mire and trusting that God is still working even when you can't see it. And by the way, for those of you that perhaps already have run and you're a couple miles or a whole marathon into running away from God, just like the prodigal son, I want you to understand there's also power in the return back to God. And it is never too late to return back to God. No matter how far you've gone, no matter what you've done, there's power in the return. The question that's facing each one of us is not, am I on God's side? The real question is God on mine? Or excuse me, am I on God's side? The question is, are we on his? God is on the side of those who are humble. He's on the side of those whose yes means yes, and they learn how to walk in that yes, even when it's hard. Thanks for listening with us today. We hope today's message has been helpful, encouraging, and challenging for you. To learn more about having a relationship with Jesus, or to learn more about our church, go to wearebethany.com.